Hello, Lisa speaking again. Unplanned video about an article I got sent about the turf war that embroils Guardian headquarters. So, what's happening at the Guardian and what has happened during the period of Kath Viner is incredibly important. The header of this article is about a dispute between Kath Viner, the editor of the Guardian, and I think a woman called Annette Thomas, who's a media executive, presumably with the Scott Trust, but I'm not entirely sure. What's happening at The Guardian is important, but this is why it's important. What they are demonstrating is how a mediating class generate instability at the end of an economic cycle. So we're at the end of the neoliberal settlement and they're imploding online. And in those terms, kind of for generations and generations and generations, historians and economists and will be fascinated and will study all the tweets and all the output of The Guardian in this period. This is actually really, really important in terms of historical analysis and will continue to be really important, especially depending on the consequences of the end of that economic settlement, which we don't know yet. So in that score, what's happening there is really important, but actually it's more or less not. Now, The Guardian and the Labour Party just worked together to try and facilitate the rule of law being undermined. They thought if you cut spending to local authorities and welfare claimants, that you could undo all the laws and systems that have developed for 70 years. But these are statutory responsibilities. The only thing you could ever do was generate a crisis. And they have just facilitated the deaths of 100,000 people. One of the people quoted in this article is Owen Jones going, the wrong side of history. Mate, if I had made as much money as you have made being the face of subordinating welfare claimants in this process, I would really give up being worried about being on the right side of history. Now, the actual trigger for this phase of the war was that The Observer, who's their Sunday paper, which I actually used to read and used to be an alright paper, have said that women, actually gender critical feminists, feminism means gender critical, which is kind of a statement about what feminism was at The Guardian and what it has been, should be safe to speak. Well, women are safe to speak. In this country, women are safe to speak. I could make 10 videos tomorrow about Boris Johnson, about what a 20 is, and I wouldn't be in any danger at all. But the problem is that in their culture, because they have been behaving like a criminal organisation, the pattern of organisation that we see here is no different to any other organised crime or grooming. You know, when the Gender Recognition Act was over, for people who are not familiar, The Guardian made trans rights activism the face of their own kind of hostility to certain systems and laws. And commission very abusive males to present the face of trans rights activism. In fact, trans people are a very, very small group. They're very, very vulnerable. And the backlash that they have generated, which is about their media culture, now threatens trans rights for good. You know, not to mention, they've generated the risk of the far right. There was a situation where British women literally had to stand up and say, actually, you can't override safeguarding in that way, and women do have the right to speak. But even in that movement, because this culture behaved with a narcissistic reflex, within a week of the Gender Recognition Act review, they had recreated a far-right centre-left spectrum. The organiser of a meeting at the House of Lords had deliberately generated risk for violence for a child and elevated far-right trolls so that she could behave that way openly and assert that she had an environment where that behaviour would meet silence and tacit approval. This is just like a standard model of reproducing abusive environments. This is cultural dysfunction within The Guardian itself, within the Labour Party, because they have not adjusted to a world where you can't just subordinate vulnerable people, you can't just seek out vulnerable people, place yourself in competition with them and wage war on them. You know, they turn their supporter base on Jewish people while they create the threat of the far right. This is after a war on Islam. The world that they can do this in has gone. They do not have a media landscape where they can do what they used to do. What's going on at The Guardian isn't new. This is 30 years sclerosis. But this is just the final generation of that culture finding that when they mix with the outside world, the only way that they can survive it is by creating an abusive bubble online. You know, like toddlers, where they put their hands over their eyes and they go, I can't see you, so it's not happening. Do you know, like, or you put your fingers in your ears, you know, I don't know, actually, if a toddler does that, be aware that there's something very wrong. But do you know what I mean? This is like children who think that if they just pretend something isn't happening, that the world will somehow match what they've produced online, which is a very toxic, very, very abusive culture where they're used to kind of being above the rule of law. They cannot function in a world where they simultaneously have power, they want power, they're plugged into the Westminster lobby, but voters have rejected Labour. The crisis of the centre-left is 20 years in and they have a circulation of 100,000. In order to maintain denial, they're kind of imploding in on themselves. With Corbynism, you know, they abuse welfare claimants, and then the people who did that for them turned in on the party itself. This is the same process at The Guardian. The top line of the dispute in The Spectator is about a dispute over whether The Guardian, or what the future of The Guardian is. The Guardian doesn't have a future because it cannot now function in a world where it hears the impact of what it does. And unfortunately, that's the world it's got. Now, I'm actually doing, with this series, on Wednesday, I'm doing my profile of Jeremy Corbyn and Corbynism and the democratic centralist model and the culture of the Labour left and where they came from and where they're embedded. So that's on Wednesday. The week after, I'm going to do a proper profile on The Guardian, particularly looking at the tenures of Aris Rosbridger and Kath Viner. So that will look at people like Polly Toynbee, Owen Jones, Patrick Butler, a social policy editor, Helen Pidd, their northern editor. She visits like northern towns and she goes, these people can't speak English. She's basically like just your standard racist, but do you know what I mean? But I will look at kind of these people, the structure of the paper, why it is that they have no future and why it is that their implosion is so important, but also why it's not. The damage that The Guardian and the Labour Party were going to do has been done. 100,000 people were killed by austerity. We're locked into Brexit. They unleashed the threat of fascism quite directly. It's done. Democracy has taken care of it. It's just that The Guardian is sustained by the Scott Trust. You know, it's a trust fund babies paper. You know, what you're seeing at the moment is a culture online who cannot function in the outside world. And what we saw even in the movement where women stood up against trans rights activism is that this culture are still using social movements to subordinate people and kind of, you know, to gain kind of political capital. But it's all wasted political capital because this culture is over. We can access democracy in 1,000,001 ways and we can publish by ourselves. We're no longer waiting by newsstands or checking out newsreels for our news. The world has changed. But I'll be back on Wednesday with that profile of Jeremy Corbyn. I'll be putting up my video about the Parthians and Persia tomorrow. I'm still actually crowdfunding for research materials and equipment to improve the quality of these videos. Currently, the cost of books for about Central Asia is quite staggering. Patreon, you can still talk to me. I actually talk to people on Patreon all the time, or I'll leave the comments open. Thank you for sticking with me today. That's my 2 penneth on the civil war at The Guardian, and I will see you tomorrow.